Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back again with another historical video. Today, we continue talking about World War One and our lecture, our section title for this lecture, World War One. So creative, I know. So let's get into it and get started. I wasn't lying. Chapter 9, Lesson 2, where Chapter 9, Lesson 1 was World War One begins. Maybe the publishers got lazy and said, World War One. All right. That was your warm up. Objectives, we're going to compare and contrast the Eastern Front and the Western Front of the war. And then we're also going to identify the effects of new technologies on warfare. All right, you thought. So, before 1914, many political leaders believed war to be impractical because it involved so many political and economic risks. Others believed that their country's diplomats could easily prevent war, but in August 1914, both of those ideas were shattered. These new illusions that followed proved equally as foolish. Government propaganda had stirred national hatred before the war. Excuse me. Propaganda, test question, are ideas spread to influence public opinion for or against a cause. Now, in August 1914, the urgent pleas of European governments for defense against aggressors please against aggressors encouraged the civilian population to support total war. Most people seemed genuinely convinced that their nation's causes were right and just, but by contrast, they also came to believe that the nations they opposed were wholly evil. The new set of illusions also fed the enthusiasm for the war. In August 1914, almost everyone believed that the war would be over in a few weeks, since almost all European wars since 1814, and in fact, been finished in a matter of weeks. The soldiers who boarded the trains for the war front in August 1914 and the jubilant citizens who saw them off believed these warriors would come home before Christmas. No, they did not. So here's some examples of propaganda. Destroy this mad brute. And this is some Russian propaganda. I have no idea what it means. All right, all quiet on the Western Front. I believe that's a book or a poem. Not sure. German hopes for a quick end to the war rested on a military gamble. German plans for a war with both France and Russia. Otto von Bismarck's dreaded war on two fronts that he did not want to do and pleaded his people to avoid, actually will happen and take place. And they hope it all depended on the early defeat of France. Now, the plan for France's defeat, called, as we talked about last lecture, the Schlieffen Plan, called for the German army to make a vast encircling movement through Belgium into northern France. But as we know, since those plans were going to violate Belgian neutrality, wasn't going to happen. So according to the plan, German forces would sweep around Paris. I don't know why I didn't capitalize Paris and allow the army to avoid the forts on their border with France and to move their army into the broad plains of Belgium. By doing this, it would give the German army enough room to maneuver and surround most of the French forces because, they'd probably move them all to the border. However, the German advance was halted a short distance from Paris at the First Battle of the Marne, which took place September 5th to September 12th, 1914. They declared war July 28th or August 1st. So just a month later, there was a battle, and they were a short distance from Paris. Scrambling to stop advancing armies, French military leaders loaded 2,000 Parisian taxicabs with fresh troops and sent them quickly to the front line. Can you imagine that, taking a taxi to the war? Yo, taxi! Or in modern terms, taking an Uber to the war. The war quickly will turn into a stalemate as neither the Germans nor the French could dislodge each other from the trenches they had dug in for shelter. The two lines of trenches soon reached from the English Channel to the frontiers of Switzerland. The Western Front had become bogged down in trench warfare, and for 3 years, the Western Front only moved about 3 miles per year in any one direction. So, when you think about it, and we talk about the loss of life in this war, it's for mere miles of land. And a lot of people will die. Again, here's a map of El Schlieffenplan. Go through northern Belgium and go, but it didn't happen. Now, we talk a lot about trench warfare, and this is the first style of trench warfare seen in the world. And so, as you dig underground, you have sandbags and sandbags. You have barbed wire protecting you. You have no man's land right in between. And this is a normal sized man, and he's about, 6 feet tall, 5 feet, 5'8", 5'10". So, these are dug down pretty deep. So there you go. And here's what they look like. I mean, this is a model. This is how it looks like in real life. And these are the lines of the Western Front from 1916 to 1917. Didn't really move much. Here are the French in taxi cabs. LOL doesn't stand for laugh out loud. Okay, unlike the Western Front, front lines covered great distance on the Eastern Front, but were marked by mobility. The cost of lives was equally enormous. More importantly, the Eastern Front didn't really have trenches. I'm not going to say there were no trenches, but it wasn't that thought out. So at the beginning of the war, the Russian army moved into eastern Germany, but it was decisively defeated at the Battle of Tannenberg on August 30th, and they were defeated again at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes on September 15th. So within a month, 2 weeks of each other, a lot of life was lost. LOL, loss of life. That's why I call it. After these defeats, the Russians were no longer seen as a serious threat to Germany. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, fared less well at first, too. The Austrians were defeated by the Russians in Galicia and thrown out of Serbia as well. But to make matters worse, the Italians betrayed their German and Austrian allies in the Triple Alliance by attacking Austria May 1915. Italy will join France, Great Britain, and Russia, formerly the Triple Entente, but were now called the Allied Powers, or the Allies. By this time, the Germans had come to the aid of the Austrians, as they will defeat the Russians in Galicia for revenge and will push back the Russians far into Russia. Russian casualties stood at 2.5 million killed, wounded, or captured, and they were essentially knocked out of the war. When you lose that many people within a month, 2 weeks, it's going to be hard. You had 1.3 million. Remember, at the beginning of the war, 1.3 million people, and you just lost 2.5 million due to injuries, wounds, or death. Encouraged by their successes against the Russians, Germany and Austria-Hungary were joined by Bulgaria September 1915 and will eliminate Serbia from the war together. Their successes in the east would enable the German troops to move back to the offensive in the west. Here's some, I think this is the picture of Battle of Tannenberg, Masurian Lakes. This is Galicia. So it's like, what is that? Hungary. These are the Italians fighting the Austrians. Remember, Austria and Italy, if you recall from last semester, they don't like each other. So it might have been seen as a shock when Otto von Bismarck pulled together the Triple Alliance. But now Italy attacks because Italy was promised land. Will they get it? I don't know. So here you have the Allied powers in purple, light purple, and then the new Central powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire will join in the fray. Here's the Eastern Front. Again, not really a lot of trenches. So when you can see heads, you're going to shoot at them. All right, in the trenches, quite literally. The Western Front, the trenches dug in 1914 had by 1916 become an elaborate system of defense. The Germans had and the French had hundreds of miles of trenches which were protected by barbed wire entanglements up to 5 feet high, 30 yards wide. Concrete machine gun nests and other gun batteries supported farther back by artillery protected the trenches. Troops lived in the holes in the ground, separated from each other by a strip of territory known as no man's land. Trench warfare baffled military leaders who had been trained to fight wars of movement and maneuver. At times, high command on either side would order an offensive that would begin with an artillery barrage to flatten the enemy's barbed wire and leave them in a state of shock. And this is called softening up the enemy. After softening up the enemy in this fashion, a mass of soldiers would climb out of the trenches with fixed bayonets and hope to work their way towards the enemy's trenches. These attacks rarely worked because men advancing unprotected across open fields could be fired at by enemy machine guns. No matter how inaccurate they might have been early on, these early machine guns, they still fired at a rapid pace. And so out of, 1,000 rounds, you might hit. I don't think 1,000 rounds is it even a viable option, but even out of 1,000 rounds, you might hit 500. That would still be good. 500 people dead? Are you kidding me? So, 1916, 1917, millions of young men died in search of this elusive breakthrough in just 10 months at Verdun in France. 700,000 Frenchmen lost their lives over a few miles of land. World War I had turned into a war of attrition, which is a war based on wearing down the other side with constant attacks and heavy losses. Machine guns, along with other technological advancements such as poison gas, aircraft, and high explosives, allowed further destruction of life on a scale that was previously unknown. So, like we said, we knew that if there was war, like we talked about in the last lecture, a lot of destruction was going to happen. And boy, did it come quick. Here's an aerial map of some trenches. Look how far. Can you imagine digging all that stuff? Ugh. Barbed wire, dead people, more dead people. All right, got that dog in them. So, trench warfare created dangerous conditions for soldiers even out of combat. Rainfall could quickly fill a trench with water and mud. Soldiers standing in these cold, damp trenches, remember, they started fighting in August through the winter. It gets cold over there before global warming, climate change. In these cold, damp trenches for long periods of time, contracted a medical condition called trench foot. Well, I don't know what voice crack. Trench foot, which would require the amputation of this infected limb. Snowfall would also bring deadly cold to the trenches, resulting with soldiers contracting frostbite. Deaths and injuries resulting from conditions often proved just as harmful to most soldiers as bullets and artillery shells. By the end of 1915, airplanes will make their first appearance on the battlefront for the first time in history. Planes were used at first to spot an enemy's positions. Soon enough, planes began to attack ground targets, especially for enemy communications. Excuse me. Fights to control the airspace occurred and increased over time, as we learned. Dogfights. At first, I love this. At first, pilots would fire at each other using handheld pistols. Can you imagine? That's like some Fast and the Furious type stuff, but in the air, like because they weren't covered airplanes. I'll show you a picture, and so they're just reaching out. Probably got one hand over here or this way, and pew 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 pew. Like that's crazy. But you had to do what you had to do. Later, machine guns would be mounted on noses of planes, which made the skies even more dangerous. Ay, ay, ay. Germany will also use airships called Zeppelins to bomb London and eastern England. That's a test question. Inaccurate and imprecise, these bombing campaigns caused little damage but frightened many people. Germany's enemies soon found that Zeppelins were filled with flammable hydrogen gas, which would quickly become raging infernos when hit with the fire from anti-aircraft guns. So watch them go poof, and then it's fire in the air. So got that dog in them. Dog fights. If you don't know who that is, that's DMX, RIP. But these are airplanes. Okay, they weren't covered, so they're just sticking out their hands. Pew pew. Oh my gosh. Wow, that's a lot. Because of the stalemate on the Western Front, both sides sought to gain new allies, and each side hoped that these new allies would provide a winning advantage, such as the new source of money and war goods. Bulgaria entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So you need to know the Allied powers, and you need to know the Central Powers. Russia, Great Britain, and France, the Allied powers, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Allies tried to open up a front in the Balkans in 1915 by landing forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula, southwest of Constantinople, which is Ottoman Empire. Ultimately, this rugged terrain of the peninsula proved treacherous for the Allied troops to land. The front opened up by the Allies was very small, which gave the Ottoman troops an advantage. In the end, the campaign was a disaster, and the Allies had to withdraw, largely led by future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. By 1917, the war had truly become a world conflict. While stationed in the Middle East, British officer known as Lawrence of Arabia urged Arab princes to revolt against their Ottoman overlords. In 1918, British forces from Egypt, mobilized from India, Australia, New Zealand, worked to destroy the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Keeping the Suez Canal open and in British hands was essential for transporting these troops from these areas to the front. The Middle East would also become another broad front in the war. Africa, too, would become another theater in the war. British, French, Italian, Belgian, and Portuguese colonial forces clashed with German forces in the last contest for the control of Africa. Africa's tropical climate and desert climates and terrain made traditional European warfare here difficult. Waterways proved crucial for moving troops quickly. The Allies took advantage of Germany's preoccupations in Europe and lack of naval strength to seize German colonies in the rest of the world. For example, Japan, a British ally beginning in 1902, seized a number of German-held islands in the Pacific, and Australia seized German New Guinea. So here are the Central Powers once again on a map in green. Lawrence of Arabia, the African theater of war. I forget what battle that is. Oh, those were the Japanese, and these were the Australian troops. I like their hat. All right, a genocide you haven't heard of. During the war, the Ottoman Turks further alienated the Allies with their policies towards minority subjects, including the Armenians. The Armenians are an ethnic group whose historic homeland is what is now called, is now Eastern Turkey. At the time, the Christian Armenian minority had been pressing the Ottoman government for years to make reforms, giving the Armenian people rights and protections. The Ottoman Empire refused to give them these rights, and in 1915 accused the Armenians of supporting the Russians in the war. The Ottoman Empire used those allegations to begin a genocide of the Armenian people. If you don't know, genocide is the deliberate mass murder of a particular racial, political, or cultural group. The Ottomans will arrest Armenian community, political and intellectual leaders, and sent most of them to their deaths. Armenian men, women, and children were forced into concentration camps. Many Armenian men were also sent to work camps where they would be forced to work until they died of exhaustion. I wonder where someone got this idea. Many would be simply murdered. The remaining Armenians that weren't sent to these camps were deported. More than 500,000 innocent people were forced into exile from the period of 1915 to 1923. Sent through the desert and swamps of Syria and Mesopotamia, 400,000 of the more than 500,000 people died on this death march. Along the way, many would be raped, tortured, or forced into starvation. Others would be kidnapped and forced to adapt Turkish customs and practice Islam against their will. Between 1915 and 1923, more than 1.5 million Armenians, more than half of their population, was murdered. Russia, France, and Great Britain denounced Turkish actions as crimes against humanity and civilization. But because of the war, these killings continued. Sad. Sad. Those are heads. Dead bodies. Genocide. And here's a movie about that time. I'm not going to show it here because, copyright. Okay. The U.S. has entered the chat. At first, the U.S. tried to remain neutral, but as the war dragged on, it became more difficult to do so. The immediate cause of the U.S. involvement grew out of the naval war between Germany and Great Britain. Britain had used its superior navy to set up a blockade of Germany and the blockade kept war materials and other goods from reaching Germany by sea. And in return, Germany set up its own blockade of Britain and enforced it with the use of unrestricted submarine warfare, including the sinking of passenger liners. On May 7th, this is a test question, you need to know it. May 7th, 1915, German forces sank the British ship Lusitania with about 1,100 passengers, including 100 Americans, and they all died. After strong protests from the U.S., the German government suspended unrestricted submarine warfare in September 1915 to avoid antagonizing the U.S. further. Only once did the Germans and British actually engage in direct naval battle. It's called the Battle of Jutland, whatever. On May 31st, 1916, neither side won a conclusive victory. Also in 1917, British officials intercepted a message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to his ambassador in Mexico. In the note, Zimmermann authorized his ambassador to propose that Germany would help Mexico, quote, reconquer land, the lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona in return for the Mexican support against the United States. Britain revealed the Zimmermann note to the American government, but when the note became public, anti-German feeling intensified in the United States. In April, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. U.S. troops did not arrive in large numbers until 1918, but the entry of the U.S. into the war gave the Allied powers a psychological boost and a major new source of money and war goods. We got the bag. That's the Lusitania. Kind of looks, when you look up this, you see a lot of pictures of the Titanic. Two different things. Lusitania torpedoed. This is the land proposed in the Zimmermann telegram. This is propaganda exploding, the Zimmermann note exploding in their hands. All right, the home front. So as World War I dragged on, it became a total war. Railways and modern naval ships transported soldiers from across the world to the front lines from their homelands. The use of industrial technology and scientific advancements, mechanized warfare, which required the use of all available resources. The lives of all citizens in warring countries, however far from the battlefields, were also affected on the home front, was rapidly becoming a cause as much effort as the war front. Most people expected the war to be short, and little thought had been given to the long-term needs. Governments had to respond quickly when the new war machines failed to achieve their goals. Many more men and supplies were needed to continue the war effort, and to meet those needs, government expanded their powers. Countries drafted tens of millions of young men, hoping for that elusive breakthrough victory. Wartime governments throughout Europe also expanded their power over their economies. Free market capitalist systems were temporarily put aside. Governments set up price, wage, and rent controls. They rationed food supplies and materials, regulated imports and exports, and took over transportation systems and industries. In effect, to mobilize all of the resources of the nations for the war effort, European nations set up planned economies. As a result of total war mobilization, differences between soldiers at war and civilians at home were narrowed. In the view of political leaders, all citizens were part of a national army that were dedicated to victory. Woodrow Wilson, U.S. president, said that men and women, quote, who remain to till the soil and man the factories are no less a part of the army as the men beneath the battle flags, end quote. England expects that every man will do his duty. Propaganda. This is the first time propaganda is seen on a larger scale, as we talked about before. Both military and civilian casualties resulted from a war that had many fronts, which helped weaken the patriotic enthusiasm marked in the earlier stages of the war. By 1916, signs indicated that civilian morale was beginning to crack. However, war governments fought back against the growing opposition to the war. Authoritarian regimes such as those in Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary relied on force to subdue their populations. With the pressures of war, however, even democratic states expanded their police powers to stop internal dissent. The British Parliament passed the Defense of the Realm Act, Defense Against the Dark Arts, as it allowed the government to arrest protesters as traitors. Newspapers were censored, and sometimes publications were suspended. Wartime governments made active use of propaganda to increase enthusiasm for the war. And as the war progressed and morale sagged, governments were forced to devise new techniques for motivating citizens, i.e., being racist. I Want You for the U.S. Army. This was the original Uncle Sam, and it was used for World War I. The Spirit of 18, The World Cry Food, Keep the Home Garden Growing. Here's some Russian propaganda. Britons wants you. Join your country's army. God save the king. All right, I believe this is the last slide. Total effort. By 1918, 16 million military personnel, civilians had died. Millions more returned home wounded. In the fall of 1918, a deadly influenza struck, adding to the horrors of World War I. Probably spread by soldiers returning from the home front, influenza became the deadliest epidemic in history. COVID. An estimated total 50 million people died worldwide. Total war had also a significant impact on European society. World War I created new roles for women because so many men left to fight at the front. Women were asked to take over jobs that were not readily available to them before. Women found themselves employed in jobs that were once considered beyond their capacity. These jobs included civilian occupations such as chimney sweeps, truck drivers, farm laborers, and factory workers in heavy industry. But the place for women in the workforce was hardly secure, as both men and women seemed to expect that many of the new jobs for women were only temporary. At the end of the war, as men returned to the job market, governments quickly removed women from their jobs they were encouraged to take earlier. By 1919, 650,000 women in Great Britain were unemployed, and wages for women who were still employed were lowered. That's sexist. Nevertheless, some countries where women played in wartime economies had a positive impact on women's movement for social and political emancipation. The most obvious gain was the right to vote, which was given to women in Germany, Austria, and the U.S. immediately after the war. British women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote, together with the right to stand for Parliament in 1918. Many upper and middle class women also gained new freedoms. In the ever increasing numbers, young women in these groups took jobs, lived on their own in apartments, and relished their new independence, which will be seen in the 1920s, especially in America. But, totally tubular. Yeah, that's Finding Nemo. Got it. Crush. All right. A little bit longer of a lecture. Sorry about that. But hopefully you guys did enjoy. Your homework, I remembered, is page 339, 2 through 4. 339, 2 through 4. All right. So yeah, a little bit longer, but hey, it was all things World War I. So yeah, there it is. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Burrs.